Okay, Tony.
Thank you.
I can say nothing more.
Introductions. I taught English literature in troubled parts of the world for more years than I care to remember. I went to Rhodesia, as it then was, and UDI was declared. I then came home and went to Northern Ireland, and the trouble started. So if the French Revolution breaks out again this afternoon, you may hold me responsible. The only other thing I'd say is that I am dealing with Burton and Swinburne. Oh God, it's poetry. Is this going to be a lecture? No, I promise you it isn't. I'm done with lecturing. Long years of done with lecturing. But to be perverse, I will start with some poetry, because what I want to talk about this morning is the curious friendship between these two most unlikely people. Whatever drew them together? Well, it's easy enough to know what was Swinburne's share of this. I'd better remember to put my glasses. Had cataract operation recently, and the whole process of wearing and not wearing glasses, that's better. A little bit of one of the poems that Swinburne wrote after Burton's death. Wouldst thou not know whom England, whom the world mourns, for the world whose wildest ways he trod and smiled their dangers down that coiled and curled against him, knows him now less man than God. Less man than God. It goes on and on and on. And just a couple more stanzas from it. Our demigod of daring, keenest eyed to read and deepest read in earth's dim things, a spirit now whose body of death has died and left it mightier yet in eyes and wings. So, what did the ebullient, assertive explorer find in common with one of the century's most epicene, extravagantly odd literary figures? Burton, quote, with his loud voice and rather sneering manner, and above all, the long sabre cut across his face, which it wasn't, of course, the look of unspeakable horror in those eyes, which gave him at times an almost unearthly appearance. Well, perhaps to the outward eye, Swinburne's appearance in some ways was almost unearthly as well. Swinburne was physically tiny. I think I've read somewhere he was 4'11" tall. His head was far too large for his body, and he was plagued by grotesque mannerisms. And alcohol, which further vitiated his physical condition, was one of the strong connections between the pygmy and the giant. Indeed, in 1879, Swinburne's alcoholic dysentery and epileptic symptoms were so bad that his literary agent and mentor, Theodore Watts Dunton, moved the poet into his own home, where Swinburne resided until his death in 1909. Swinburne and Burton shared a wide-ranging interest in erotica. Flagellation crops up with great frequency in the conversations of Burton, Swinburne, and their mutual literary friend, Monckton Milnes, who later became Lord Houghton and was kind of evil genius in guiding the friendship of the two of them. Both of them genuinely loved poetry, certainly. And the recently published translation of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam had made a tremendous impression on both of them. It particularly influenced Burton's longest essay at serious poetry, the Qasida, from which Jerry and I will read you brief excerpts this afternoon. For the first time understanding them since that very good talk on Sufism that we had before coffee. Thank goodness for that. They first met on June the 5th, 1861. Burton was breakfasting with Monckton Milnes, and there, quote, he met a small, delicate, red-headed, hero-worshipping young man of 24. There was 17 years between them. The swarthy and muscular Burton and the delicate, pale Swinburne took an immediate liking to each other. I've failed to answer the question that was the thesis of my paper, haven't I? What brought these two together? And I don't know. Burton must have seemed to Swinburne the living prototype of all literature's adventurers, a hero in real life who had actually done what he himself could only dream of doing. But what first attracted Burton to the young poet? Perhaps he simply enjoyed being hero-worshipped. Burton himself was no more than a versifier, but he recognised in Swinburne a unique and precious talent for poetry. They met again, January 1863, at Monckton Milnes' country house, and again, I quote, "There were books all over the house, English poetry, theology, magic and witchcraft, executions and punishments, and erotica," if that wasn't the same thing. These subjects were a mutual bond for Burton and Swinburne. Do I use the word bond advisor? They hit it off at once. The rest of the company, and again I quote, would hear only the murmur of excited talk, an occasional shriek of laughter from Swinburne. The corrupting influence that Burton is said sometimes to have exercised over Swinburne probably consisted mainly less in lurid subjects than in urging poor Swinburne to drink vastly more brandy than was good for him, and certainly in encouraging his interest in erotic literature. Swinburne's second series of poems and ballads was inscribed to Burton in redemption of an old pledge and in recognition of a friendship which must always count among the highest honours of my life, and that volume included a poem to Burton. In turn, Burton's translation of the Portuguese poet Camões was dedicated to Swinburne, who responded, "The learning and research in your work are in many points beyond all praise of mine, but none more notable than the strength and skill that wield them." There was another link. Burton was a member of the Cannibal Club, an absurd extension of the Anthropological Society, whose capers needn't concern us here. Revolt against conventionality bonded its members, and Burton introduced Swinburne to it in 1865, and Swinburne wrote one of his most avowedly unsuccessful poems, The Cannibal Catechism, which they used to chant before every meeting, schoolboys. The two were together again in June 1869 in Vichy. By now, Monckton Milnes regretted his to the young poet. When Burton left for Brazil on consular duties, Swinburne teased Monckton Milnes, "As my tempter and favourite audience has gone, I may hope to be a good boy again." They corresponded even while Burton was in Brazil, and my source says chiefly about erotica. Does that correspondence exist?
I don't know. Ask somebody who might.
Anybody who knows about it, tell me afterwards. There's curiously little direct testimony as to what the formidable and very protective Isabel reacted to this seemingly not entirely respectable friendship. On first acquaintance, she just mentions casually Swinburne as one of the great men who dined with Burton. And when she joined the pair in Vichy, she made no deprecatory or alarmed response to them being together. This, of course, all changed in Swinburne's vitriolic attacks after Richard's death, when Isabel so contentiously destroyed many of Burton's manuscripts. "That poor liar, Lady Burton, she's befouled his memory like a harpy," said Swinburne. And he wrote again in one of his epitaphs, referring to the fact that Isabel had striven desperately to convert Richard to Catholicism for over many years, and then engaged in perhaps what weren't altogether honest tactics right at the end of his life. Swinburne recalls, priests and the soulless serfs of priests, that is Isabel, may swarm with vulturous acclamation, loud in lies about his dust, while yet his dust is warm, who mocked as sunlight mocks their base blind eyes. The corpse be theirs to mock, the soul is free. Free as ere yet its earthly day was done, it lived above the coil about us curled. A soul whose eyes were keener than the sun, a soul whose wings were wider than the world. It was partly outrage at a literary crime, partly the sense that Isabel had betrayed the very core of Burton by insisting that he had at the very last minute undergone a conversion to Catholicism. Byron Farwell, one of the standard commentators on Burton, reckoned that both men had the same curious desire to shock and to make themselves out to be, in fact, worse than they were. However strange the bonds between them, they were strong and enduring. It's one of the more curious of literary friendships, and I'll end with the concluding stanzas of Swinburne's elegy on the death of Burton, Swinburne's most touching and final accolade to this unlikely friendship. What loftier heaven, what lordlier air, what space illimitable, insuperable, infinite, now to that strong-winged soul yields ampler place than passing darkness yields to passing light. And there it is, one of literature's curiosities, but a fascinating one, and one that I must say led me, for the first time in a long and undistinguished career, to look at Swinburne seriously. I made a great discovery. I'd like to share some of it with you this afternoon.